Hello, today we're talking with Anne O'Brien, and we're looking forward to hearing about her work on the Paston women. Anne is an internationally published historical fiction writer. I believe you've done 9 novels and 1 novella to date.
I have, yes.
And your current one out at the minute is The Queen's Rival, which focuses on Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, the King's mother.
Yes.
But we're here to talk about what's in the pipeline. And I believe that's a book on the Pastons.
It is for September of this year, and it will be called The Royal Game.
How did you come across the Pastons? How did you find out about them, and what made you decide, oh, I've got to write a novel on them?
I've been aware of them for some years because of writing about medieval women, but they've always been in the background. But it became clearer to me how important these women were, particularly the Paston women. And the men are interesting, there is no doubt, in their battle for their inheritance and for Caister Castle. But the women come over very strongly, and particularly Margaret, of course, who wrote almost a quarter of the letters that are extant. And so, since I write about medieval women, it seemed to me that I really couldn't ignore them any longer. And that often happens when I write, when I start writing a novel. They sort of make their wishes known to me. How can you not write about us? And so the Pastons took their rightful place in my next novel. And I thought their voices should be heard loud and clear from medieval Norfolk. They are a fascinating group of women.
And for anyone who maybe hasn't encountered the Paston women before, why are they fascinating?
They are all very different in their own way. Although in others they are very similar. They all appear to have a very strong will and ambition. They are determined to make a place for themselves in their own household, or more differently than, in a wider world. I thought that they would fit very well together as different voices in a novel. And so my first one centres on Margaret, of course, as the matriarch, the keystone, who is so strong-willed. She continues, she lived for 62 years. She doesn't willingly hand over the reins of power until almost her death. She keeps a strong reign over her household, her servants, her sons and her husband, although sometimes he irritates her and does what he wants. So she seemed to be the keystone of the book. But then there is her sister-in-law, Elizabeth. Now, she is a sad person, a pawn in the marriage game, and I thought she deserves to be looked at. It was very difficult for her to find a husband. She suffered cruelty and great unhappiness. And then she was dealt an amazing card that gave her a husband who took her out of the Paston circle for a time, and she was very happy. Sadly, as the history with the Wars of the Roses at that time, he died in battle, and her second husband is executed, so that her happiness is very short-lived. And this must be the story of so many medieval women at the time. And I thought she deserved a voice too. And then the other one, of course, is, sorry, I'm thinking here. The other one is Anne Haute, who didn't quite become a Paston. She was very much enthralled by Sir John Paston, the courtier, the flamboyant guy who liked the tournaments and being a courtier. She hoped to become a Paston, and he seemed to be very much enthralled by her at the beginning. And she is so important because, of course, she's first cousin to the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville. Sadly, she didn't get her way, and she becomes a victim of Sir John's inability to commit to anything for any length of time. And although they exchanged marriage vows privately, he was not willing to continue with that. And so she becomes a woman experiencing great pain and loss when her lover abandons her. And these three women seem to me to be a perfect trio to introduce their lives and what the Paston men are doing at the time in a first book of the Pastons.
So this is great. So you're actually telling the Paston story through the lens of the women. And so do we get an insight into the male characters from the female perspective?
Yes, certainly. So it's John, of course, the husband of Margaret, but her two sons, particularly John 2 and John 3, how difficult it makes for a novelist when they've all got the same name. But yes, they come over very strongly in the book, but very much from the viewpoint of the women in their lives. They don't always come out of it very well, as you might imagine. But I think I've done them justice, of course, because they do deserve our admiration too, particularly with the Fastolf inheritance and trying to keep their hands on Caister Castle and the other estates as well. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, behind all this is the Wars of the Roses, and they have to decide which side is best for them to fight for, whether it's York or Lancaster. And they fight for both on a number of occasions, because they have to keep an eye on what their patron is doing and who will support them in their wish to hold on to their land.
So it sounds like the family as a whole is quite pragmatic as a way to kind of survive through this period, and that pragmatism comes through in the characters and the emotions of the women that you're writing about.
Yes, I think they see the need to compromise, to discuss. They don't always like what they have to do, but local affairs are very much at the beginning in the hands of the Dukes of Suffolk and Norfolk, and it's very difficult for them to make progress. Eventually, they become attached to the Earl of Oxford, and they fight with him in one of the battles, and of course they lose. They are on the losing side, and then of course they have to ask for a pardon and hope they get their lands back. So it very much is a history of treading carefully and watching what your enemy is doing. They always hope that the king, Edward IV, eventually might come down on their side, but it's a difficult life for them.
So this sounds quite fascinating. It sounds like it's a take on the historical period of the time, the Wars of the Roses, but these are people who are just outside the edges of the court, but we're getting to see a glimpse into what life is like for this group in society. Not just strong individual Paston women, but we're getting a bit of a commentary on what life was like then.
Yes, that's true. And the interesting one there is Anne Haute, who really shows us what's happening at court and how it's important to make friends. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And so we see Sir John too at court, and how he tries to gain friends there with great difficulty. And of course, lack of money for the Pastons is always the problem. And if you don't have enough money to bribe or to encourage, then life becomes even more difficult. And when enemies in Norfolk and Suffolk are waiting like carrion on a line to swoop and take as many estates as they can, it's very difficult for them to collect rents from their Paston tenants. And John, Margaret's husband, often gives it the job to her to go and make sure that the rents are collected, or to the bailiff, and she finds life difficult, and there is no way around it. They've got to step carefully.
So it sounds as if there's quite a lot of the story that we can relate to today. Would you say is there a balance to achieve the fact that you're doing historical fiction, but you're also trying to address readers today, and how do you deal with that?
I don't think there is anything that's happening today that's quite the same, but I try and make the story very much of family relationships as well. And we can all associate with that. The problem of marriage alliances, the difficulties of getting daughters into marriages that will be good for the family, And of course, it's always unhappy for a number of the Paston young women. I mean, Anne Paston, one of Margaret's daughters, she ends up in what seems a very unhappy marriage into the Yelverton family and loses a child, and her husband doesn't really want her unless she's got enough money to make the marriage, worthwhile. And also relationships between fathers and sons, where the mother, Margaret in this case, has to step in and smooth the atmosphere when father is furious and the son equally so. And the son, Sir John, leaves home and will not return. And father says, no, and I don't want you to until you start pulling your weight at court. It's this atmosphere with family that I think all readers today will enjoy and find a certain degree of acceptance with, that this happened. It happened so many hundreds of years ago. It's no different now.
So it sounds like you're really achieving that mission of writing the Paston women back into history, but also using the Paston women themselves to give us a view on history.
Yes, both. I think at the moment, because the Paston women are very much in the non-fiction variety of being developed, not enough people know about them. I think that through social media, as you know, of course, and through fiction, more women will see them and understand how important they are. I get a lot of followers on social media who say, well, I know about the Pastons, but I have never got very far with reading their letters. I would love to read about them in fiction, and I hope that's what I can do. And then, of course, when they enjoy them, they can go back and read the letters for themselves.
And just as a little bit of a spoiler alert, I believe that there's a second novel maybe on its way on the Pastons?
Yes, the first novel ends, as I say, with the three women, Margaret, Elizabeth and Anne Haute, in 1469, when the siege of Caister Castle opens up with the Duke of Norfolk with his troops outside the castle. And so the second novel will take the story on and introduce some of the new generation of Paston women. So Anne Paston, one of the daughters, and her marriage. Also Marjorie Bruce, of course, who marries John III, an heiress who finds that it's becoming very difficult for her family to get the marriage settlement off the ground because of problems of a dowry and a jointure. And she's the one who writes the Valentine's letter to John III and says, look, don't turn your back on me, I need you. She really wanted to marry him, and she made it quite clear in her letters. And the other one, of course, a fascinating glimpse, is the daughter Marjorie Paston, who married the bailiff. To the fury of the Paston family, they valued Richard Calais, but only because he was an excellent worker for them. They didn't want him in the family because it brought back the old arguments that really they were from serfs and bondsmen. And if that was so, they were not able to inherit land and will land to other people. They got over that problem to some extent by concocting a bogus ancestor, Wulstan de Paston, who had come over with the conqueror, they said. And they've got this family tree made up. And yet here was Marjorie doing all she could to destroy what they'd achieved, or so they thought. And so Marjorie married Richard, but as far as we know, she was forbidden to return to the Paston household. Now, it may be that she was allowed to return as a visitor, and it may be that that's in the letters that disappeared. It would be very nice to think that that was so, but we don't know. What we do know is that Margaret, in her will, left something to her grandson, Marjorie's own son, so that there is that connection. But perhaps Margaret and Marjorie never did make up for this terrible marriage. What a wonderful thing to write about in fiction.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm really looking forward to later in the year when you're going to come back and talk to us a little bit more about that whole process of writing historical fiction and how you use
Yes,
letters and change them into and novel material. But before that happens, the book is launching, the first book on Margaret, Elizabeth and Anne in September. And that's
yes,
from HarperCollins, the HQ Stories series.
yes.
And it's called The Royal Game.
Sorry, the Royal Game, the
Yeah.
Royal Game. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for talking to us today, Anne, and we look forward to resuming the conversation later in the year.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. I've really enjoyed it. It's always a great pleasure to talk about characters who've lived with me for so long, and the Paston ladies have been with me for well over a year now, you know, perching on my shoulder. It's been lovely to talk to you about.
That's great. Thank you, Anne.